What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another very special video on the optimal Scout Loadout for 2019. So in this video today, we're going to take a look at all Scout's weapons, primary, secondary, and melee, see which weapons are still viable and which ones are pretty much trash, and we're going to try and build the optimal Scout Loadout by picking the best out of each category. So to get started, I went and picked up each weapon available to the Scout, played around with it for a little while, and drew some conclusions from my play experience. I also looked at what other members of the TF2 community thought through Steam community posts, Reddit forum posts, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Also, all the statistical information such as numbers, base damage, damage per pellets, this has all come straight from the Team Fortress 2 wiki. I'm also not going to talk about items such as mutated milk or the frying pan, since those are just reskins of base weapons such as the baseball bat and the mad milk. So with all that said, let's get right into it. The first Scout primary is the stock Scattergun. Now all Scout primaries have 32 bullets available to you to be carried at once, and they have a certain amount of damage per pellet. And this is where this gets confusing with Scout primaries. You have a certain amount of pellets per shot and a certain amount of damage points for each pellet. With the Scattergun, you have 10 pellets and 6 damage per pellet, creating a base damage rate of 60, compared to, say, the Force of Nature, which has 5.4 damage, but 12 pellets per shot. Now, I'm not going to include these pellet numbers because while it's interesting, it's not really applicable here, because we can go completely off of base and critical damage compared to weapons and get the same idea without having to throw in all this unnecessary technical information. Just want to make that clear before we continue. I'd also like to add that for critical shots, you get 3 times the base damage per shot. This is the only time I'm going to mention any of this in this video. Now, the Scattergun has a base damage of 60 hit points per shot and can hold 6 bullets per clip. Now, arguably one of the biggest advantages starting off just with the stock is that you already have the gun with the highest clip size out of all the primaries for the Scout, which allows you to zip out a bunch of high damage shots one right after the other upon your unsuspecting target, before you even have to reload. Now, if your aim is half decent, you can get a kill without too much trouble. Now, it might not seem like anything special right off the bat. Get it? Bat? See what I did there? Okay, yeah, that was terrible. Anyway, the stock Scattergun is pretty good right off the bat. It has the highest clip size, a good base damage, and you can load a lot of high-powered shots. So any competitors to this are going to either have to make up for some very significant downsides or add a lot of decent damage and specialty tactics to improve their overall position above what the Scattergun already offers to the aspiring Scout player. The Force of Nature. The Force of Nature has a base damage rate of 65 hit points, which is 8% higher than the Scattergun, but you only have 2 shots per clip. Now, the advantage to this gun is on hit, it applies a knockback effect that propels the enemy target backwards and you backwards away from them, assuming you are both airborne. Now, the advantage to this is you can use this tactic to increase your jump ability. Let's say you jump up a step or 2, hit your target like an airborne soldier, get knocked back, and then allow yourself to jump more mid-air. This is a super effective tactic for getting an additional shots at your target. However, the downside to this is you can only shoot 2 shots before you need to reload again. However, there is a 50% faster firing speed, and you reload both bullets at once. Potential downside, though, is if one shot is unused, like you only shot once, and then auto-reloaded, well, you're gonna lose that other shot that you didn't take. It doesn't stay in your chamber. A minor downside, but a downside all the same. Now, this gun can take a little while to learn and be comfortable with. It's definitely a gun that takes a bit more practice than just the Scattergun to master. But it can be a fairly effective weapon, especially if the main tactic is to jump around your enemy really fast and avoid letting them see exactly where you are, which is a good strategy for the Scout to have. It's also pretty darn effective against market guarding soldiers, pyros with jetpacks, and stuff like that. However, that really low clip size really does come back to bite you, especially when you're trying to do 1v1s with other Scouts who are equipped with a Scattergun. I honestly would say that this gun, while still a very viable option, is just not quite up to par with the stock Scattergun. The Shortstop. The Shortstop has a clip size of 4 shots and a base damage of 48 hit points, which is 25% less damage than what the Scattergun offers and 33% less of a clip size. So what's the upside then? Well, it has a 42% faster firing speed and has a clip-based reload, which means you can reload all 4 shots at once. Also, it has a very interesting alt-fire mechanic where you can do a shove that will push enemy players right on top of you off over to the side. Now this is an interesting tactic because when you push and shove players away and kind of jolt them in the air, that gives you the chance to reload your gun and shoot at them while they're still in the air, pushing them back further. Now, is this a big enough advantage to make up for the gun's downsides? I don't really think so. You're still dealing with a smaller clip size and a lowered base damage to boot, and on top of that, you also have an additional downside of having a 20% increase in push force taken from damage and air blast while you have the gun deployed, which means you're only going to be pushed back further, making you a more ineffective shot. I gotta give the gun props for having an interesting flare, but we're not judging guns here on interesting flare, we're judging them on performance, and the Shortstop comes up just a little bit short. The Soda Popper. The Soda Popper's claim to fame is that it has a height meter that is placed on your HUD when the Soda Popper is equipped. On hit with the Soda Popper, you build up hype, which allows you 5 additional air jumps for 8 seconds after dealing 480 damage. Quite a lot of numbers to remember, but you get the idea. The Soda Popper has a base damage of 60 hit points, but only a clip size of 2 shots. Its other advantages have a 25% faster reload speed and a 50% faster firing speed, but just like the force of nature, if you don't use both shots and it reloads the clip, then that one shot is lost. This weapon is honestly kind of disappointing, mostly because it's just kind of cool looking, but it isn't very practical. It's just another kind of a gimmicky weapon. And honestly, after you do 480 hit points of damage, which does take a little while, your only reward for it is 5 additional air jumps in an 8-second period. That's not really a huge advantage. It can be useful at times, but just think about it. When is 5 additional jumps going to make or break you as a scout player? Again, Soda Popper, kind of a cool idea, but just not very practical on the battlefield. Because of that, I'm gonna have to give this weapon a lower score. It's not as good as the Scattergun, the Force of Nature, or the Shortstop, really. Babyface Blaster. The Babyface Blaster has a 4 bullet clip size and a base damage rate of 60 hit points. Now, equipping this weapon slows the Scout down, starting off from 133% of normal speed to 120% of normal speed, thus making the Scout a little bit slower. However, a boost meter is placed in the HUD when the weapon is equipped, and dealing damage regardless of whether you use the Babyface Blaster or your secondary or melee builds up the boost meter, which increases the Scout's speed up to 173% of normal speed, or 40% more than normal. The boost meter maxes out at 100 points of damage dealt. However, the downsides to this are fairly significant. You have a boost reduced on air jumps and a boost reduced when hit. This weapon is actually really neat because the increased speed is actually fairly advantageous. The problem is, it doesn't really work very well unless you're kind of not taking very many shots and you don't use your double jump mechanic. If you kind of stay close to the ground and don't do your double jump using your air jump, then you can build up a boost fairly quickly. But the problem is, if you're being hit and using your double jump constantly, which most, talented scouts are doing, you're not gonna really get a chance to build up your boost to its potential. Now, what's disappointing about this weapon is it kind of has, the potential to be great to get that increased movement speed, but the problem is it just doesn't really work out very practically. Plus, you have the lower clip size and the slower movement speed kind of on top of it, so you have to really build it up somewhat to even get your money's worth out of it, so to speak. So, cool idea, but just not really executed very well. The Backscatter. The Backscatter has a clip size of 4 shots and a base damage of 60 hit points per shot. Now, the advantage to the Backscatter is, true to its name, it mini-crits targets when fired at their back and at close range. So if you're a camping scout, you stop at a door and an enemy darts out and doesn't even see you and just keeps on going, you can get right behind him, mini-crit him, and take him out with just a couple of shots. Works pretty well, right? Well, problem is, you have less shots available to you, no random critical hits, and worst of all, a 20% bullet spread, which means your shots are really not going to be that effective, especially since you only get the mini crits when you're at close range anyway. This is another great example of a gun with a really cool gimmick, but it's not really practical in more than just maybe a few situations. A great gun if you're going to be camping, but Scout isn't really a camping class. It's a class you're going to move around and shoot at people from across the map with. You know, if I'm shooting at a heavy or a pyro or another scout from across a control points map, and I'm engaging with them, I'm going to be at a direct disadvantage because I'm shooting less damage because of the 20% bullet spread and having less bullets to shoot to boot because of the smaller clip size. I'm only gonna mini crit when I'm behind them and they don't realize I'm there, and when I'm kind of close behind them anyway. Which is also not good if they decide to turn around and start countering me like a pyro with his flamethrower, because now their back is not turned to me, and I'm kind of at close range to them, so I need to back up really quickly. Because of this is just not a very good weapon. You know, great idea in a few circumstances, but not very useful very often. I mean, maybe if you want to be a scout that camps in the sewers of Two Fort, this might be the gun for you. But for most scouts who are just playing scout primarily or as their main class, or just playing scout, I don't want to say properly, but playing scout in the typical orthodox scout fashion, not the gun for you. All right, moving on to secondaries. Now we're gonna start with the stock secondary weapon, which is the pistol. Now this has a clip size of 12 bullets and has a damage rate of 15 hit points. Just like all other secondary weapons that have bullets, the maximum amount of bullets that you can carry is 36 at a time. So 3 clips for the pistol. As far as secondaries go, it's pretty okay. It shoots the bullets quickly, you can reload all of them at once, keep firing through 3 clips. Not a weapon you're going to be using very often since you'll primarily be using your primary weapon, but if you run out of ammo or you just need to fire off a little bit of burst damage, it's a fairly effective secondary. Not much more to say about it. The Bonk Atomic Punch. Now, instead of having a gun for your secondary, this is a little support can of soda. Now, what kind of superpower does it give you? Well, when you drink it, you're immune to all damage, but you are unable to attack. Knockback still affects you. This effect lasts for 8 seconds, and then there's a 24-second cooldown before you can use it again. Now, to put this in perspective, when you drink this soda, this Bonk Atomic Punch, you are invulnerable and you switch to a third-person view for 8 seconds, and then you can move about without damage from any of the sources inflicting upon you. Sounds pretty good, right? Now, the downside to this, however, is you're still affected by knockback. So, what does this mean? Well, let's say you go into Two Fort's courtyard, for example, and there's a level 3 sentry. That level 3 sentry is not going to be able to damage you, but it will still knock you in a particular direction. If you're trying to run up the stairs and the sentry is throwing you towards the wall, it's going to be very difficult to get out of its shot range. However, it's still a very effective tool for avoiding other players' shots. Temporarily, of course. One potential very large downside to this is after the effect wears off, you as the user get a slowdown effect based on damage absorbed, scaled from 25% at low damage to 50% at 200 damage or more. So let's say a pyro sets you on fire a little bit while you've got this invulnerability aspect going. Now, he's not going to inflict damage upon you, but after that 8-second effect wears off, you're gonna be a little bit slower. And if somebody inflicts a crit rocket on you, well then you're going to be 50% slower after this cools down. So it's going to make it a little bit easier for people to catch up to you and, engage with you. So is this a good weapon? Well, situationally it is. There are some strategies I can think of where this is very useful. Let's say you and a heavy are going to a courtyard to take out an enemy sentry. Well, the scout can drink this and run up close to the sentry, drawing fire away from it so that the heavy can shoot it down. The poor engineer who's trying to keep it alive can't really do much because the sentry's not shooting the person who's actually doing the damage to it. If you need to get through a little group of people really quickly, it can also be somewhat effective for that as long as you can kind of push your way past them. On the other hand, there's a lot of situations where this is not going to be good as well. If you're low damage, you just need to retreat. Well, stopping to drink this isn't effective because it's going to take you a couple of seconds to drink it, which is just going to make you a target for anybody doing that last little bit of damage they need to kill you, since the effect only starts after you finish drinking the soda, which takes almost 2 seconds. On top of that, if your situation suddenly changes and you need to take a shot, you can't do that until your 8 seconds are up. So let's say you get past a few players and then you get to where your team is and they need you to shoot to help defend, you gotta wait for the extra 2 or 3 seconds until your shield is down and then you can start shooting again. So because of all of this, I would say that this is a good weapon, but only for situations. I would recommend you keep this in your inventory if you need to create a diversion, but would I say, should you use this in your loadout most of the time? No, there are just far better alternatives available. Cit-a-Cola. The distant cousin to the Bonk Atomic Punch, the Cit-a-Cola is another soda type weapon where when you drink it, it has the same 8-second effect time, the same 24-second recharge. But unlike the other one where it gives you invulnerability, this one gives you the ability to deal mini crits on every shot for 8 seconds. Sounds pretty good, right? But you're already thinking, what's the catch? The catch is, any attack you make while using these mini crits will mark you for death for 5 seconds after you make the attack. And that 5 seconds can carry over to even when the effect has run out. Now going into this weapon seemed like it would be a little bit overpowered because it's giving you the ability to do so much more damage with your shots, just for having a little bit more, exposure to other people's damage towards you. I'm thinking I can go in there with my Scattergun, take out a person with 2 shots, move on to the next one. In reality though, it doesn't really work that well because most of the time people are going to turn around and fight back before you kill them, believe it or not, or there's going to be other people near you that are going to do damage, and that is just going to make you run out of health very slowly, and retreating is not very practical, especially since the whole point is to deal as much mini crits before the effect runs out anyway. Hey, if you're effective at dodging damage from other players, then 1, you're a lot better a scout player than I am, and 2, this weapon might very well be for you. However, I didn't find it very practical to use most of the time as a scout. It had its cases where it was, useful and helpful, but most of the time, I just felt like I was just kind of par for the course. I did more damage, but I took more damage. I would have just rather had the secondary pistol, to be quite honest. So, final verdict, not a weapon I would recommend for your secondary. Mad Milk. Now this is actually one of my favorite secondaries for Scout, and plays a lot bigger a support role than the Bonk Atomic Punch could ever play. Enemy players covered in milk that you have thrown at them creates a situation where any of your team attacking these players gains 60% of their damage done back as returned health, with the exception of Afterburn. Now that already gives you and your team a fairly decent upper hand, and if that wasn't good enough, it also partially nullifies a cloak on enemy spies, making them visible so you can shoot them, and it extinguishes fire on the welder and on the allied players. Now this weapon does have a 24-second recharge time, but if you extinguish an allied player, that's decreased by 20%, or 5 seconds. What's most appealing about this weapon is that it offers such a variety of things that you can do with it to help yourself and your teammates in fights against groups of enemies or even just single enemies like pyros and spies. And the only real downside to this is you're out of spot for a secondary gun like a pistol. Now, does that make it the best secondary? Well, we have some other stuff to look at before I make a final verdict, but one thing I will say, it is definitely a great weapon, and I would definitely mark it as a viable alternative to the stock pistol. The Winger. The Winger has a base damage rate of 17 hit points, which is 15% more damage than the stock pistol. However, it only has 5 bullets per clip, which is a 60% smaller clip size. The only other additional changes to this pistol over the base stock pistol is that the jump height is increased by 25% when you have the gun active. This gun actually has pretty decent specs compared to the stock pistol on paper, but in actual practice and in gameplay, I didn't find it to be particularly useful. Don't get me wrong, the extra damage was nice, but it was held back by this much smaller clip size, so it really just wasn't very useful. Usually I'm using the pistol when I'm, retreating and I have to wait for my scattergun to reload. But when the clip size is small and people are, coming up and pummeling you, well, you kind of need all the bullets you can get. The extra additional damage just doesn't make up for it. On top of that, the extra jump rate was just not particularly useful. You could get the same sort of benefit by having a triple jump effect with the Rap Assassin, a melee weapon I'm going to cover a little later on. Now, if the 25% jump height increase was active regardless of whether you had the weapon deployed or not, well, that might be a different story. But it's dependent on if you have it out or not, which again is really just not very useful. Definitely not a bad gun by any stretch, but not great. Pretty Boy's Pocket Pistol. The Pretty Boy's Pocket Pistol has a base damage of 15 hit points per shot, same as the pistol, but it has a 25% smaller clip size with only 9 shots per clip. I was fairly surprised at how good this weapon actually is considering it has been nerfed in the past. On hit, you can gain up to 3 extra health points depending on how far away your enemy is when you're shooting them. On top of that, the firing speed is 50% faster. This might not sound like a big benefit considering the smaller clip size, but it is if you think about it. In my playstyle, I'm using my pistol mostly when I'm retreating from enemies. So when I'm firing the pretty boy's pocket pistol at a pyro that just caught me on fire, I'm gaining a few precious health points while also damaging the opposing pyro, and I'm shooting him at a faster firing speed than I would otherwise be, which makes up in part for the more frequent reloads. This weapon is actually pretty stinking good. Our last secondary weapon is the Flying Guillotine. The Flying Guillotine is one of those weapons that you throw and then it recharges after such an amount of time. It has a base damage rate of 50 hit points, and then also a bleeding damage rate of 8 hit points for 5 seconds. This weapon actually packs a really powerful punch for a secondary weapon since it gives you 50 damage up front, and then causes bleeding damage after that. And the recharge time is fairly reasonable at only 6 seconds. Now the Flying Guillotine used to be a pretty decent secondary weapon. It does a large amount of damage. If thrown from a distance, that damage could be increased with mini crits, and when combined with the Sandman, if you timed your shot just right, you could get a guaranteed critical hit. Problem is, this weapon has been severely nerfed in recent years. Now instead of getting mini crits on a long range hit with this weapon, the only benefit is the recharge time is reduced by 1.5 seconds. And if that wasn't bad enough, you also can't get a guaranteed critical hit when using with the Sandman anymore. The Sandman itself has actually also been nerfed, but I'm going to discuss that later when we talk about melee weapons. Now you might be thinking, well, okay, you still get a pretty decent amount of damage for secondary, plus it has that bleeding effect, so it's still a good weapon, right? Well, not really, and here's the reason why. One, there's no random critical hits with this weapon, which is fine, because that usually doesn't make or break a weapon. But more importantly, this weapon is very hard to hit people with, even at close range. The reason for this is that when you throw the weapon, it doesn't fly completely straight, it flies more at an arch, and it's difficult to figure out if you can shoot the player because you have to mentally think how high the arch is going to go, where it's going to come down, so shots are not easy to make at all. They're a little bit random in a way, almost like if you're shooting the Huntsman. So even though it packs a decent punch, you're just really not going to get much benefit of it because it's so difficult to hit with. And don't even get me started about long range. It's near impossible to get long range. And now in its nerf state, what do you get anyway? 1.5 seconds of recharge time when the recharge time is already really short? Not really a benefit to be going home and bragging to your mom about. Oh, and did I mention, this secondary does nothing against sentries or any buildings except just bounce off of them. Yeah, definitely not a win in my book. Alright, and now we are heading into melees, the last section of Scout weapons. So, for our first one, we have just the stock bat. It has a base damage range of 35, crit damage of 105, pretty normal melee weapon, just your standard thing, used to clean up the leftovers of health that an enemy player has when you've already been pumping out with the Scattergun and they get all right up in your face, all nice and pretty. Not very useful against a pyro per se, but can be decent when you're up close range against another scout. Honestly, the most useful time I've personally found for a melee like the bat with Scout is when you're dealing up close and personal with a projectile-based class like Soldier or Demo, or when you're in head-to-head combat with another Scout and you're in close quarters to one another. Since then, a Scattergun shot with decent aim is going to be so hard to pull off since you're just circling one another all the time. For our first variation of the bat, we have the Sandman. The Sandman's claim to fame is that its alt-fire is to launch a baseball at your enemy. And here I would like to touch on the infamous Sandman Flying Guillotine combo. Basically what you would do is with the Sandman, you would alt-fire your baseball at an enemy and it would stun them for a few seconds. Then you would take your Flying Guillotine and throw it to hit them, and that would create a guaranteed critical hit that would kill almost all classes immediately, except for maybe some of the more larger health ones. The problem is, not only was the Flying Guillotine nerfed, the Sandman was also nerfed. Now, when you alt-fire, instead of getting the stunning for a few seconds and now they are vulnerable to anybody who comes up to shoot them with no way to defend themselves, now if you hit someone with an alt-fire, you know what the benefit is? It slows the enemy down for between 1 to 8 seconds depending on the distance from when you hit them. That's all. You can pick up the baseball, unlike the Flying Guillotine, but really, is there any benefit to that? I mean, really, you're just gonna make them slow down a little bit. Oh, joy, that's gonna be super useful. So what's the downside for this weapon, you may ask? You lower the maximum health of the Scout from 125 to 110 health points. Your health is actually lowered by 15 points, while the base damage rate and the critical damage rate are still the same. This weapon had some of the greatest potential of all Scout melees in the past for doing damage and putting your enemy in a sticky situation. Now it's just about a direct downgrade as a Scout melee. Do not use this weapon. The Candy Cane. The Candy Cane, just like the Bat and the Sandman, has a base rate of 35 hit points. Its claim to fame is that a small health pack is dropped when the player kills an enemy, regardless of whatever weapon the player was using in order to kill the enemy. In other words, you can use your primary, your secondary, or your melee to kill an enemy, and they will drop a small little health pack that you can pick up. Very useful upside, and there's no downside for damage dealt. So what's the downside for this weapon? Well, your vulnerability to explosives is raised by 25%. I could definitely see the appeal of this weapon when you're in a lobby where there's not going to be very many soldiers or demo men, like say maybe a high tower lobby where everybody's just trolgering all over the place. But most of the rest of the time, you're going to be more on the downside from having this weapon equipped. The little health kits are very nice and very helpful, but most of the time, if you go up against a soldier or a demo and they have any sort of decent aim, you're going to be dead, guaranteed. Whereas before, it's already difficult enough to combat these classes, you don't really have much of a chance of staying alive now. Because of that, really wouldn't recommend this as a melee option. The Boston Basher. The Boston Basher has the same base damage rate of 35 hit points. However, on hit, it'll cause your enemy to bleed for 5 seconds. However, on the other side, the downside to this weapon is that if you miss hitting the enemy, you swipe at them and they avoid your shot, it causes self-damage and causes you to bleed for 5 seconds. This weapon is really tough, because if you're really good at aiming the melee against an enemy opponent, it can do some serious damage. However, an enemy can always avoid your shots and then you're the one in the hole. Now, since you usually use your melee when you're up close and personal with the peep, and when you really can't get in a good shot on them, or it's just not the best time to be shooting at them, and usually when you're trying to finish somebody off, this weapon is usually just not the best one to use in those situations because you're probably already in a low health state yourself, and putting bleed damage on yourself by a wrong aim or a bad hit, you're just not going to be sitting very pretty. One interesting use for this weapon that I see a lot of people using it for is when a medic is trying to heal you and increase his uber, you can use it to inflict damage on yourself so that his uber charge rate will be charged more quickly as he's actually healing from damage. This is definitely a big enough benefit to keep it around your inventory for those situations, but I still would not recommend the Boston Basher for normal Scout gameplay. The Sun on a Stick. The Sun on a Stick guarantees critical damage on burning targets, and it gives you a 25% damage resistance from fire while the weapon is active. On the downside, it deals 25% less damage for a base damage rate of 26 hit points. This is not a good weapon, and the reason why is because unless you're teaming up with a pyro buddy and going up against other players, you're really not going to do very well getting critical hits against burning enemy players, because how often as a scout do you go up to a burning player real close and then have the opportunity to hit them with the melee? That's just not a very common thing. Also, the 25% damage increase from the weapon, it only works when it was active. Now, if it worked whether you had the weapon out or whether you were using your gun, then it would be a decent melee. The problem is, if it's only while it's active, then if you're on fire, you can't defend yourself when you're trying to escape. You can't shoot the pyro coming after you, can't shoot another scout chasing you, can't really do anything. All you can do is just run away with this weapon out and then, swipe at anybody who's in your way, I guess. It's really just a very situational weapon where there's not a whole lot of situations. And on top of that, you do 25% less damage. For the most part, just an overall downgrade of a weapon. I mean, there are some situations where this would be better, but Sun on a Stick is not a good melee choice. The Fan o' War. The Fan o' War is probably the most conflicting melee weapon I have on this list, because the first problem is the base damage rate is only 9 hit points. That's right, only 9, 75% less damage than what all the other melees would do. But it has two very powerful components. On the first hit that you get with the melee, your target is marked for death, which means all the damage they're taking from you and from any other players is now going to mini crit for 15 seconds. And then on top of that, the Fan of War gives you a critical hit whenever you would normally get a mini critical hit. This means if you're going up against someone covered in Girardi, you're going to get a critical hit. If you mark someone for death and then hit them again, you're going to get a critical hit. Very, very powerful stuff. I actually stopped working on this video and went back and played with this a second time after already playing with it to get additional thoughts, just because I felt so conflicted over to, give this weapon a good kind of a review or a bad one. And at the end of the day, I would say this weapon has a lot of potential to be very good, but you would have to be very good as a scout and know your timing in and out to make full use of it. For the more casual scout player, a stock melee is just going to serve you more purpose because you're going to be getting more damage in less hits, when it's kind of make or break with melee than if you use the Fan of War. I think Fan of War could be used as an excellent strategy weapon, but I'm not a scout main and really couldn't see for myself personally when this would be a better choice over just a stock melee. Still, there are some situations where it could be beneficial, but I really just don't think it's going to be the best choice for most scout players. So as much as I hate to say it because I admire the powerfulness this weapon has, just not the best choice for most scout players out there. Still, go ahead and try with it. Maybe you'll find out some sort of secret advantage it has or something. I haven't found one yet, but after using it, I'm tempted to play around with it some more for a while and see what I can do. The Atomizer. The Atomizer has a base damage rate of 30 hit points, which is 15% less damage than the stock melee. However, it grants the ability to triple jump when the weapon is deployed, and melee attacks mini crit while you're airborne. However, an additional downside is that the weapon deploys 50% slower. The Atomizer definitely has situations where it's a useful weapon to have, especially when the triple jumps allow you to get to a place where you normally wouldn't be able to get from. Say, the roof on top of the bridge from 2 Fort to get to the enemy's battlements. The mini crits on airborne melee attacks are also definitely a big plus, especially when you're just jumping around a soldier or a heavy and you're hitting him from up top or above, you can get in some additional damage. Personally though, I didn't find this weapon to be particularly useful or any of its upsides to be over advantageous compared to what I could get from the stock melee, mostly because I find myself using melee weapons when I'm up close and personal with somebody, and bouncing around and stuff isn't usually the best option. Also, the negative 15% less damage and deploying the weapon 50% slower also hurts you more than you might initially think. 15% damage isn't too bad, but it does add up, and pulling the weapon out 50% less time, that's just more time you're vulnerable if you run out of ammo or you need to pull out and engage in a melee fight really quickly. I know part of that is personally just my style, but I feel like it also applies to other scout players. Still a decent weapon and probably one of the best of all the variants, but I would still say it's somewhat slightly below the stock melee. Still, it definitely has potential as a weapon in good situations where it would be useful. The Rap Assassin. The Rap Assassin does 15 hit points worth of damage, which is 65% less damage than the stock baseball bat. It's going to have some pretty big upsides like the Fan of War in order to compete, since it has such less damage. So let's take a look at what its upsides are. The Rap Assassin, much like the Sandman, can alt-fire a projectile, in this case a Christmas ornament, that when hitting an enemy player causes bleeding damage, and if it hits the ground explodes, causes a small amount of damage to people near it. It takes 7.5 seconds to recharge, and of course you can replenish it from the resupply cabinet. That's it. There is no other advantage to this. It's basically just a discount Flying Guillotine. You have the ability to cause bleed damage to an enemy, which again is hard because of the arching nature of using the baseball bat to shoot a projectile. But when the situation comes up that you actually need to use your melee at close damage, you have 65% less damage to rely on. No mini crits, no mark for death, no nothing. This is a trash melee weapon. Please don't use it. It's pretty much makes the Sandman look good. Like, that's how bad the Rap Assassin is. Don't use it for a scout, okay? Pretty please. Try it if you want to, but it's just not gonna do you any good. Is the weapon a direct downgrade? Yeah, pretty much. So, after reviewing all the scout weapons in this exhaustingly comprehensive video, we are now tasked with designing the best scout loadout around all of these weapons. So, what's it gonna be? For primary, I'm going to pick the Scattergun. The Scattergun really just gives the best all-around option for Scout. Most shots in a clip, you know, just great damage ability, and above all, you can just get out the most damage quickly before you have to reload again. It's a great weapon, it doesn't have any fancy gimmicks, it's just an awesome shotgun for you to go in, do some excellent damage, and then get out. For secondary, I'm going to say the best one for this loadout is the Mad Milk. It was honestly a contest at this point between the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol and the Mad Milk, but I chose the Mad Milk for the best loadout because the Mad Milk has so many just situations where it becomes useful. You can put yourself out when caught on fire by throwing it against the ground, which is awesome because pyros are probably one of the hardest things to counter as a scout. If a spy disappears, you can make him reappear by throwing the milk in his direction where he last was, and usually hit him, making him partially visible so you can take him out with your scattergun. You can throw it at enemy players so that when you're shooting them, you gain health from all the damage you do, and also allow your teammates to gain health from damage they do as well. Also, it's just a great way to put out teammates when they're on fire. It's almost a support weapon in a way. The biggest downside potential to this is that if you run out of ammo for your scattergun, you don't have a secondary weapon to fall back on and start doing damage with. But I definitely think the Mad Milk makes up for this in what it offers you versus the potential downside of running out of ammo and being stuck. However, as an alternative to this, you could go with the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol, which is a great weapon because it gives you the same amount of damage while giving you precious health points. Even with having to reload more often, which puts you at risk of being killed, it's still a great weapon, especially when needing to retreat. For melee, we're gonna go with the stock melee bat. It's definitely the best for just doing damage, for cleaning up people when you're up close and personal. It does the most damage. It's overall just a great way to combat enemy players. Alternatively, you could go with the Atomizer if you're great with jumping and landing airborne shots, if you don't mind dealing with a fairly reasonable decreased damage rate. Alrighty guys, well that is the optimal Scout loadout for 2019 in Team Fortress 2. What did you all think of the video? Please be sure and let me know down in the comments. Do you have any suggestions? Do you have your own preferred Scout loadout that you would like to share? Let me know, I would definitely love to read it and get your guys' input on it. I appreciate all you guys who have been waiting for this video. I know it took a long time to come out. I had to get through school finals before I could finish working on this, and I had to record gameplay, do a lot of editing. The audio before editing was almost 40 minutes long. So yeah, it's just been a pretty big project to do this. But I hope you guys found it useful, informative, and all that awesome stuff. So thank you all very much for watching. Really do appreciate it. If you did find the video helpful and you would like to leave a like, please do so, because it would really help get the video promoted in front of more eyes, help the channel grow a little bit. If you have other guides you want to see that you would like me to make, let me know in the comments, and I'll see if I can maybe make a video on it at some point in the future. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Until next time, be sure and drink plenty of tea, play a lot of Scout and TF2, and I will see you all at the top.
Aside from my soul.